In our ignorance, we thought our only option was to fight. We thought that if we killed him, we would protect ourselves, our way of life. However, it was through this violence that we brought great misery upon ourselves. No one knew that self-preservation would bring such horror to us. Millions died. Millions more were never found. We did not understand. Our God was not a vengeful God. He just didn't want to be fucked with. Chapter 1. This again. He thought he would never wind up here after last time. In fact, it had been almost 5 years since he was here. He hated this place. Everything about it was uncomfortable and painful, especially when he first got here. It was as if he went through the same bullshit every time. He didn't like a single thing about this horrid hole in the middle of wherever it was. Everything here sucked, but the pit was the worst. And unfortunately, it was the only way in or out. He didn't come here by choice. He always just wound up here, like he was being drugged into this place. As soon as his eyes closed and he fell asleep, he would wake up in this hell. The pit was such a horrid place because of the dredge and the slime that filled it. It was nearly impossible to move through and coated every inch of him as if he had taken a swan dive into the stuff. He would spend what felt like hours just trying to get out of this godforsaken shithole pit. The thick black mixture looked like oil and moved like tar. It covered his entire face, all but one eye. He couldn't even breathe. The first few times he was in here, he was struck down by sheer panic. There are many horrible things in this world, but not being able to take in a lungful of air was one of the worst. Normally, he would just pass out, but in here, not getting to breathe is not a means of escape. This was just one of the tortures that awaited Sam in this hell. The amount of effort that he needed to exert to pull himself from this sludge was enough to break most people into tears. And by the time he got out, that is exactly what he was doing. Crying. He hated the struggle of freeing himself from that goddamned pit. The smell of that disgusting sludge would stick to him like glue. He knew that even when he finally woke up from this nightmare, that smell would become plastered on the inside of his nostrils like a thick layer of snot that he just couldn't get out. This dream was not just some random firing of his sleeping brain. His nightmarish hell was a nightly torture for most of his childhood. Nothing had changed about this place. The sky was still black as smoke. The heat was like standing in a fire, and it created massive gusts of searing wind that would blow the still burning embers that filled the air right into his face. His eyes always felt as though they were cooking inside of his skull. The fire destroyed everything here. No matter what the scenery was, it looked as though it were rusting in a fiery kiln for decades. This particular time, it was the cityscape outside of his apartment, but it was always somewhere different, as if a snapshot was taken of the world around him and then set ablaze for all eternity. Some things never change. Sam called this place the Furnaces. He was completely lucid in these dreams, though he did not have the kind of control that most would expect to get from a truly lucid experience. He couldn't fly or instantly acquire super strength. His body was bound to the physics of this world. Sam simply retained his logical mind in here. However, there was no escaping his emotions. After years of very intensive therapy, he was able to escape this madness. The wall he built held strong and steady against the constant push of the dark bastard that lived behind it. Until now. Sam always heard muffled voices in these dreams, but this dream was the first time he ever heard intelligible words. This voice was unlike any he had ever heard before. Its power washed out all of the other sounds that usually deafened him in this hellish dream. With a mighty and thunderous voice, it said,
All that power is pointless unless you can control it.
These words seemed to pound on the walls of Sam's head as he made his screaming ascent into consciousness. They pounded so hard in his mind that they reverberated against his ears as he gasped for air. Sitting straight up from his coma-like sleep, the discombobulation that often accompanies waking up at such a rapid rate was not there. In fact, Sam had never been more aware of anything in his entire life. He could feel every single drop of sweat on his brow, brought on by that vision-filled sleep. Each drop possessed a unique shape and personality of its own. He could taste the funk of plaque and night-old spit that hung in his mouth, as well as the thick, humid air that rushed over his tongue as it filled his lungs with rapid, deep breaths. The tips of his fingers were so keenly aware of every divot in the pattern that covered the microfiber pillows he so tightly clutched in his palms that he knew how many were touching his hand and how deep they were. 219 on the left, 196 on the right, each are 1/64 of an inch deep. As the sounds of his dreams began to fade into the abyss of his subconscious, new sounds overwhelmed his ears. The world around him instantly divided into several audible layers, like that of the rainforest as you descend to the canopy. At first, he could hear the roar of traffic 3 floors below as it penetrated its way through the balcony door. The crushing sound of rubber on concrete and combustion engines rattling and revving as they accelerated through the intersection, trying to beat the yellow light. The thud of a car with a heavy subwoofer mounted so poorly that it rattled the trunk. The splash of tires as they caressed the edge of the puddles gathered along the curbs from the previous night's storm. As the seconds passed, he could hear faint glimpses of conversations from the outdoor patios of the hipster coffee shop across the street, and the click of high heels walking hurriedly past as they rushed to return to work. Sam released his Loctite grip on the upholstery and placed his hand on the side of his face, fingers covering his eyes, and he began to rub them slowly in an attempt to get a grip on what seemed to still be a dream. But this was no dream, and the reality that was invading him was about to get worse. As he pulled his fingers from his eyes and his hands from his face, he muttered, 2,063 whiskers, 9,014 pores, and a whole lot of what the fuck? His eyes bulged open in complete disbelief at what just flew out of his mouth. Then, it got bad. Gazing down at the carpet below his feet, he could see each fiber as though he was looking at the world's highest definition television with a magnifying glass. He could see the follicles of hairs that were growing out of his legs, dirt particles encrusted on the fabric of the shorts that he slept in, and the coagulated cells of blood that stained his shirt. Sam lost it. Almost as quickly as he could think, he rushed down the hall into the bathroom. He crashed into the tiny sink, mounted below the tiny mirror, so hard that it cracked away from the wall, knocking all of his toiletries off of the edges that they so delicately balanced on. He rammed into it, hard enough in fact, that even the tiny mirror fell into the very same sink and shattered into dozens of pieces. The sound was so deafening that Sam immediately clutched his ears and stumbled back, screaming, "Fuck!" Shaking his head, he leaned forward toward the sink again and reached in to grab a tiny piece of the mirror that was now much more miniature than before. As he did so, he mumbled, 37 pieces, too small, 28th, that should work. The sliver that he chose was the largest piece in the pile, and it was indeed the 28th piece from the bottom of the sink. He raised the sliver of a mirror up in front of his face, and once again, his eyes bulged in disbelief at what he was seeing. His eyes had changed color and pattern. Normally, they were a soft brown. They, of course, had a distinct pattern, just like everyone else's eyes. But if you didn't own his eyes, or spend your days staring at them like some star-crossed lover, you would have never noticed any pattern at all. Nevertheless, Sam knew what that pattern looked like, and today, it was different. The color changed to a yellowish gold. Not that of a poisonous snake or a possessed alley cat, but an alluring, almost soothing gold, with yellow highlights radiating from the center around the pupil. The pattern was nothing short of perfect. It was a series of 9 tiny circles, equidistant from each other, as well as the pupil. In between each pair of circles was a perfect black sliver that guided one's focus back towards the pupil. Even Sam felt slightly hypnotized by them. His disbelief grew even more. In an emotionless gesture, he dropped the sliver of tiny mirror back into the sink, and upon impact, it broke again. 43 pieces rolled off of his lips as though he did not even want himself to hear it. He closed his eyes slowly. He stood up straight and took in a deep, calming breath, placed his hands on the edge of the sink, and sank his weight into it. And again, he could sense tremendous amounts of information. He could feel that the temperature of the porcelain was a cool 64.7 degrees as his hands settled on the smooth surface. He could see each bit of grit, dirt, and soap scum that appeared to be glued to the sink from the 6 weeks that he had occupied this apartment. Random whiskers that had not made it down the drain from the last hack shave job a few days ago were clearly visible. He exhaled and slowly opened his eyes, looking down into the sink, and hoped and prayed he would see himself looking back up from the tiny broken mirror. Not these strange and unfamiliar eyes, but the soft, patternless brown eyes he had known for the past 23 years. This was not the case. What Sam saw were 43 pairs of golden eyes staring back at him with the same unanswered question of what the fuck. It was all just a bit too much for this young man to handle at 30:00 on a Monday morning. His young but extremely masculine square jaw clenched and the muscle tensed, causing the whiskers on his face to conform to its shape. His grip on the edge of the sink increased exponentially, causing the porcelain to burst under his vice-like grip, sending shards ricocheting off of the walls and porcelain powder puffing up into the air. Son of a... Sam shouted from behind his tight-clenched teeth. He began shaking his hands vigorously and bouncing up and down ever so slightly. Fucking ow! Apparently, Sam's sense of pain was amplified as well. He immediately opened his hands, palms facing upward, and began to survey the damage on his now bleeding hands. He could see the dust and leftover debris of the sink that was still stuck in his hands, magnified in crystal clear detail. He could see several lacerations to his palms. Each was deep and nasty. As he began to focus harder, he could see that the wounds were already repairing themselves. The cells that were rushing to the wound to begin the coagulation process were apparent and vivid. Barely visible capillaries already began to constrict. Sam could not help but feel like he was watching some sort of time lapse of the entire process. What was even worse was that he noticed a startling resemblance between the blood on his hands and the blood on his shirt. The pain already began to subside. He reached up to the wall right next to where the tiny mirror resided only a few moments earlier, grabbed what was no doubt a very non-sterile hand towel, wrapped it around his left hand, and clenched the end of it into his palm. He grabbed the second towel with his right hand and simply squeezed it. He always heard you should apply pressure to open wounds, but Sam thought that was stupid as hell because right now, his hands were stinging like a son of a bitch from the towels and the pressure. He leaned back against the wall, dropped his head slightly, and looked towards the ground. He giggled in a sort of deranged fashion and said, 514 squares. He was referring to the pattern of the cheap vinyl flooring of the bathroom in this shitty studio apartment. All he could think was, I need a smoke. Without hesitation, he exited the now destroyed tiny bathroom, grabbed his cigarettes and lighter off of the cluttered coffee table that he had gotten from a back alley, and headed to the door. Upon entering the hallway, his senses overwhelmed him again. The normally disgusting smell of the overly sweaty alcoholic that lived across the hall was far more intense and seemed to stain the inside of his nostrils instantly. It was a smell he knew all too well from his childhood. Caught completely off guard, Sam paused for a brief moment, as though he were trying to hold back the worst puke ever. Then, he retched. Placing his hand over his mouth in a fist shape, he decided that he needed to get out of this hallway and fast. Upward was salvation. Upward was fresh air. Moments later, Sam reached the top of the 6th floor staircase. He dug into the almost empty pack of smokes and pulled out a cigarette, being careful not to grab the lucky one that he had flipped upside down in the pack. He put the butt between his lips and drove his shoulders into the beaten red door to open it. The door flew off of the hinges and traveled some 10 feet away from the frame itself. The flimsy metal door landed with a crash that was thunderous and loud even to the average person. But for Sam, it was almost crippling. Once again, he drove his hands up to his ears and hunched over in pain. As if it was not bad enough already, the light from the midday sun rushed into the dark stairwell, filling the dank corridor with more light than his eyes were prepared to handle. Pain seemed to be the common theme of the day. Pain and confusion. Gathering himself, he stood upright and raised the back of his towel-wrapped hand to his forehead in an attempt to shade his eyes from the blistering bright sun that felt like it was searing his retinas. Staggeringly, he exited the stairwell and stepped out onto the rooftop. Sam came here to smoke 5 or 6 times a day. It was his thinking spot, his hidden place away from the rest of the world. The one place that never changed for him, no matter how bad things got. The one place that he could truly be alone. Today, however, nothing was as it should have been. With his pupils finally constricting and offering him the slightest bit of relief from the overpowering sun, Sam fumbled for his lighter, trying to get it to light, but with no luck. He shook it vigorously a few times and tried it again. Just as he managed to get a flame and bring it to the tip of the cigarette, he heard a voice in the place where there should not be voices. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the voice said. In true smoker fashion, Sam lit the cigarette, inhaled deeply, with the intention of replying on the exhale. Nicotine first, all else second. Sam began to cough so violently that he sounded like the car from earlier with the poorly installed subwoofer that made the trunk rattle. Saliva streamed from the rim of his mouth and began to drip onto the ground. The coughing seemed to go on for about a minute or so and involved Sam puking before he was able to calm himself enough to ask, "Who the hell are you?" Not interested in the answer, Sam stood there, straight-legged and bent at the waist, hands on his knees, still coughing a bit. Standing before him was a well-dressed man. He wore a light brown herringbone jacket with a collar popped and the sleeves rolled up to reveal the bright white shirt below. The sleeves were a bit longer than they needed to be. Holes were punched into the cuffs and the man's thumbs were sticking through, making a pseudo-glove. His pants were regular fit faded denim that broke slightly at the ankles. His shoes appeared broken in, black leather loafers with a square front. They were the kind of shoe that you pay a lot of money for so that they look worn when you buy them new. Atop this 6-foot-tall, sharply dressed figure was the head that would make even the most heterosexual man say, "Damn, that dude is sexy." The 5 o'clock shadow and perfectly swept blonde hair only seemed to complement the penetrating vivid blue eyes, sculpted nose, and square jaw. The man extended his right hand to shake Sam's and said, "I'm Michael, your recorder." "My what?" replied Sam snidely as he raised up to eye level with Michael and wiped a bit of drool from his lips. "Your recorder," said Michael. "It'll make sense in a few minutes." With one eyebrow raised, his nose all scrunched up, Sam said, "I'm not a musician, and I don't need anything recorded, buddy. I can't help you." He spoke to the man as if he were turning down a bum on the street who was asking for change. Sam began to reach for his cigarette that was lying on the rooftop, still smoking from the coughing fit he just went through a moment ago. Clearing his throat, he pinched it between his fingertips and raised it up towards his lips when Michael interrupted once more. "Are you seriously going to do that again?" Sam placed the smoke in between his lips to the right side and squinted his right eye to prevent the smoke from getting in it. What are you, the fucking cigarette police? Trying to keep me from killing myself? I mean, no offense, but you should just let me smoke in peace and give me some space, man. Sam rattled off. Almost as if he were reading a quote from the most well-known story in the world, Michael replied with an emotionless response. You couldn't kill yourself even if you wanted to. And you're stuck with me for the rest of your life. With a single sarcastic, forced laugh, Sam said, Is that so? He took another drag of the cigarette and proceeded to relive the horrendous coughing fit from only moments ago. While scratching the back of his head with his right hand, Michael said with the slightest hint of frustration, Look, I don't feel like wasting most of the day trying to convince you that what I have to say is real, so I'm just going to show you, okay? Once again, in the smoker's hacking position, bent over, head down, drooling, Sam raised his towel-wrapped hand out in front of him in an agreeing fashion, a gesture that said, Sure thing, but fuck off. Michael said, Fabulous, and rushed into Sam's personal space faster than the normal person could perceive. Sam saw the entire action in slow motion. He was so stunned by what was happening that he could not react. He had never been in a fight before. He had had his ass kicked constantly, but was never allowed to defend himself and never dealt with confrontation like this. For his first encounter, this was off the charts. Michael had grabbed him by the collar and by the leg of his shorts, lifted him off of the ground, and as if throwing a bale of hay, spun 360 degrees before tossing Sam off of the rooftop. Sam, still paralyzed from the shock and awe of what was happening, did not fall to the ground. Michael had thrown him so hard and with such force that Sam rocketed out instead of down. He flew from his rooftop beyond the apartment building next to him and came crashing down like a sack of potatoes on the rooftop of a 4-story apartment building some 250 feet away. Trailing only a split second behind him was Michael, soaring through the air in angelic fashion. Like something out of the Matrix, Michael landed on the roof while Sam was still tumbling like a rag doll. Casually, Michael strolled towards Sam. Gasping for air, Sam rolled onto his back, only to see Michael towering above him. The sun was blasting out from behind his head like a painting on the Sistine Chapel, and looking down at Sam with eyes that glowed like ice blue sapphires, Michael spoke in a booming, authoritative voice. I am the Archangel Michael, created for Ra, the 6th replacement of this world. I am here to record everything you do for the rest of your 11 lives. I have been alive for 11,364 years. I cannot die. You cannot kill me. Michael reached down and once again grabbed Sam by the collar of his shirt, raised him to his feet without a single drop of effort, and said, People are going to try and kill you over and over, and no matter how hard you try, they will succeed, and you will die again and again, and I am here to watch. With a look of utter confusion and disbelief, Sam gazed at Michael. His inability to speak clued Michael into Sam's mental state. Maybe Sam was having some serious emotional problems at the moment. From the look of his eyes, he had checked out. Sam, hey, Michael began snapping his fingers in front of his face. Are you there? If you are, you need to get it together, man. Michael pursed his lips to the side slightly and cocked one eye towards the ever-so-stunned young man in front of him. Utterly pathetic. 5,000 years together and I get dumped for this moron. With a sigh, he leaned back slightly, still keeping one eye on Sam's scared and lifeless expression. Well, I guess it can't be helped. Michael drew back his right hand. He reached so far back that his fingertips almost touched the rooftop, and in a fashion that would have made Cat Williams proud, he swung that hand forward and pimp-slapped Sam so hard that it took him off of his feet. Once again, Sam tumbled like a rag doll. After finally tumbling to a stop, he lifted himself up to his knees and spit the blood from his mouth. You hit like a bitch, Sam grumbled as he peered out at Michael from underneath his eyebrows. In an instant, Sam exploded towards Michael. He moved faster than any Olympic sprinter could ever dream. He went from catatonic to a full-on rampage in the blink of an eye, and the rage on his face was apparent. Moving forward with the force of a wrecking ball and the speed of a cheetah, Sam collided with Michael, taking him off of his feet. There was so much force and speed behind his action that he drove Michael into the wall of the brick elevator housing that was on the far side of the roof. The two collided into that wall with a tremendous thud and sent cracks rippling through the red brick structure. "Woo!" shouted Michael as he donned an overly exhilarated grin on his face, completely unfazed by the massive impact he just sustained at Sam's hands. "So this is why he chose you. You're all piss and vinegar, aren't you?" said Michael as he widened his eyes in excitement. "What is wrong with me?" growled Sam. "Why is this happening to me?" He gave Michael a little extra shove into the already cracked wall, causing small bits of brick and dust to crumble away. The intensity filled Sam's eyes with tears and frustration. His teeth clenched tight as he shouted from behind them, "Answer me!" Bits of drool flew from the edges of his lips as he gave Michael one more solid shove. This one was enough to break the wall and send Michael through it. Landing on his back, still giggling, the rubble from the now smashed and broken brick wall piled on top of him. It was only a moment before the Archangel was standing up, brushing the rubble from his well-polished exterior. With a few pats and brushes to remove the dust from himself, he placed his hands on his lapels and adjusted his coat, popping his collar. "There is nothing wrong with you," he said with pure confidence. "You are perfect, or at least on your way to perfection. It's all just part of the process." "Stop fucking with me," Sam barked as he fell to his knees, driving the heels of his hands to his forehead as if he were trying to crush his own skull. Sam broke down. He said, "Just tell me what is going on. How did this happen?" "You honestly don't remember? I swear you're worse than he was." Michael sighed as he raised his eyebrows for a second. He extended his hand and said, "Take my hand, and I will show you how this happened. But I'm warning you, you won't like the answer." Sam reached up and grabbed Michael's hand as if he were shaking it. "Get ready for one hell of a flashback." Michael closed his eyes and whispered something completely unintelligible. Sam's eyes rolled back in his head as he slumped forward, lifelessly.